The Imperial flagship Eternal Dawn was the largest ship in the galaxy. It stretched for miles across the black emptiness of space, carrying thousands of soldiers, servants, and the most powerful being in the known universe, Emperor Taiho of the Keth Empire. The Keth were beautiful in a cold way. They stood 8 feet tall with silver skin that seemed to glow in any light. They had 4 arms and eyes that could see in total darkness. For 10,000 years, they had ruled over hundreds of planets and dozens of species. They believed they were the greatest beings ever created. And most of the galaxy had learned not to argue. Deep in the belly of this massive ship, in a place where no important person ever went, a small human girl crawled through a ventilation shaft. Her name was Yuna. She was 11 years old, and she had been a slave for as long as she could remember. Yuna was thin and small, even for her age. She had dark hair that she kept short because long hair got caught in machinery. Her hands were rough with calluses, and her knees were permanently bruised from crawling through tight spaces. She wore gray clothes that had been washed so many times they were almost white, and she owned nothing else in the world. She had learned very early that the best way to survive was to be invisible. She never spoke unless someone spoke to her first, which almost never happened. She never looked anyone in the eye. She never complained, never cried where anyone could see, and never drew attention to herself. She was a ghost, moving through the ship like a shadow, doing the jobs that no one else wanted to do. Today, her job was cleaning the ventilation shafts on Deck 17. It was dirty work. Dust and grime collected in these narrow passages, and the air recyclers could not work properly if the shafts were blocked. So Yuna crawled through them with a small brush and a cloth, wiping away months of buildup, breathing through a thin mask that did little to help. She did not mind the work. The shafts were quiet, and no one bothered her here. She could think her own thoughts and remember things she tried not to remember at other times. She thought about her mother sometimes, though the memories were fading. She remembered a warm voice and gentle hands and a feeling of safety that seemed like a dream. Now, her mother had died when Yuna was 6. Or maybe she had been sold to a different ship. Yuna never found out. One day, her mother was there, and the next day she was gone, and no one would answer a slave child's questions. After that, Yuna had been traded 3 times. Each time, she went to a worse place. Each time, she learned to expect less. By the time she ended up on the Emperor's flagship, she had stopped hoping for anything at all. She just survived, one day at a time, one task at a time. As she crawled deeper into Shaft 17C, Yuna noticed something strange. There was a faint smell in the air that did not belong, something chemical and sharp. She stopped and lifted her head, sniffing carefully. The Keth might have had better eyes, but humans had better noses, and Yuna had learned to trust her senses. She moved forward slowly, following the smell. The shaft curved around a corner, and then she saw it. A small device was attached to the wall of the shaft, right where the main air conduit connected to the life support system. It was about the size of her 2 fists put together, made of dark metal with blinking red lights. Wires ran from it into the conduit itself. Yuna froze. She had never seen anything like this before, but she knew immediately that it was wrong. She had spent years crawling through these shafts, and she knew every pipe, every panel, every bolt. This thing was new. This thing did not belong. Her heart began to beat faster. She thought about backing away, about pretending she had never seen it, about continuing with her cleaning and letting someone else deal with whatever this was. But then, she looked at the wires again. She looked at where they connected to the conduit. This shaft fed directly to Deck 3, where the observation hall was. She had heard the other slaves talking about what was happening on Deck 3 today. The Emperor was meeting with 3 powerful faction leaders, the most important people in the galaxy. were all in one room, and this device was connected to their air supply. Yuna was not educated. No one had ever taught her to read more than basic words, and no one had ever explained how machines worked. But she had spent 5 years living inside this ship's walls. She had watched engineers repair systems while hiding in shadows. She had studied broken machines that no one bothered to fix and figured out how they worked on her own. She understood patterns. She understood how things connected to other things. This device was meant to put something into the air. Something bad. Something that would hurt the people breathing that air. She should tell someone. That was the right thing to do. But who would believe her? She was a slave. She was human. If she went to a guard and said she had found a bomb, they would laugh at her. Or worse, they would think she had put it there herself. She would be killed before anyone even checked if she was telling the truth. Yuna sat in the shaft, staring at the blinking lights, feeling more alone than she had ever felt in her life. She was 11 years old. She had no power, no voice, no one who cared if she lived or died. The smart thing to do was to crawl away and let whatever was going to happen, happen. The lights blinked faster. The device made a soft humming sound. Yuna thought about her mother. She thought about the last thing her mother had ever said to her, words she had held on to through all the years of pain and loneliness. We do what is right, little star, even when it is hard. Especially when it is hard. Yuna took a deep breath. Then she crawled toward the device. She did not know if she could stop it. She did not know if she would survive the next few minutes. But she knew that if she did nothing, people would die. Thousands of people. And she would have to live with that knowledge forever. Her hands were shaking as she reached for the wires. The device hummed louder, and the lights blinked faster. And somewhere above her, an emperor and his enemies sat in a beautiful room, breathing air that was about to turn into poison. Yuna was just a slave. She was just a child. She was invisible. But right now, she was the only one who could save them all. Yuna's fingers hovered over the device, trembling in the dim light of the ventilation shaft. Up close, it looked even more frightening. The red lights blinked in a steady rhythm, like a heartbeat counting down to something terrible. The humming sound was getting louder, and she could feel a faint vibration through the metal floor beneath her knees. She had no tools. She had no training. She had nothing but her eyes, her hands, and a mind that had always been good at seeing how things fit together. Yuna forced herself to breathe slowly. Panic would not help her. Fear would not help her. She needed to think. She looked at the device carefully, studying every part of it. There was a main body made of dark metal, about the size of a small box. From this box, 5 wires ran outward, 2 black and 1 blue. The red and black wires connected to a small container attached to the side. The blue wire ran directly into the air conduit. The container worried her the most. It was made of glass, and inside she could see a pale green liquid. She did not know what it was, but she knew it was not good. Poison, maybe. Something that would spread through the air system and kill everyone in the observation, all before anyone knew what was happening. The timer on the device showed numbers she could not read. The Keth used a different counting system, and Yuna had never learned it. But the numbers were getting smaller. She could see that much. Whatever was going to happen, it was going to happen soon. She thought about what she knew. The device needed power to work. The power came through the wires. If she cut the right wire, the device would stop. If she cut the wrong wire, the device might explode, or the poison might release immediately, or something else terrible might happen. 5 wires. 1 chance. Yuna closed her eyes and listened. She had always been good at listening. When she was younger, hiding in dark corners, she had learned to understand machines by their sounds. Every system had a voice. Every wire carried a different kind of energy. If she listened carefully enough, she could almost hear them speaking. The two red wires hummed with a high, sharp sound. Power wires, she thought. They brought energy to the device. Cutting them might stop the timer, but it might also trigger an emergency release. The two black wires had a lower, steadier sound. She thought they connected to the glass container, controlling when the poison would be released. The blue wire was different. It was almost silent, just a faint whisper of energy. It ran to the air conduit, but it did not seem to be doing anything yet. Maybe it was waiting for a signal. Maybe it was the last step in the chain. Una opened her eyes and looked at the blue wire again. In her experience, the quiet parts of a machine were often the most important. The loud parts did the obvious work, but the quiet parts made the decisions. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small knife. It was not really a knife, just a piece of sharp metal she had found years ago and kept hidden. She used it to cut through stuck bolts and pry open panels. It was the only thing she owned that was truly hers. Her hand was shaking so badly that she nearly dropped it. She took another breath, then another. She thought about her mother's face, blurry now after so many years, but still warm in her memory. "I am scared," Una whispered to no one. "I am so scared." But fear did not stop her. It never had. Fear was just another feeling, and feelings could be pushed aside when there was work to do. She positioned the knife against the blue wire. The metal was thin but strong. She would have to cut quickly and cleanly. If she hesitated, if she only cut partway, something might go wrong. Una counted to 3 in her head. Then she pressed down hard and pulled the knife across the wire. There was a spark. A small flash of light. The humming stopped. The red lights flickered once, twice, and then went dark. Una stared at the device, not breathing, waiting for something terrible to happen. But nothing did. The device was dead. The timer had stopped. The glass container sat silent and still, its poison trapped inside Dot. She had done it. For a long moment, Una could not move. Her whole body was shaking, and there were tears running down her face that she had not noticed before. She had been so sure she was going to die. She had been so sure she was going to fail, but she had not failed. She had saved them. All those people in the observation hall, all those important Keth who had never looked at her twice. They were alive because of her. Then she heard the footsteps. They were heavy and metallic, echoing through the shaft from somewhere behind her. Security drones. The ship's automatic defense systems must have detected something. Maybe the spark when she cut the wire. Maybe her presence in a restricted area. Whatever the reason, they were coming for her. Una grabbed the device and started crawling backward, but she knew it was hopeless. The drones were faster than her. The shafts had only a few exits, and the drones would know them all. She could not escape. Part of her wanted to try anyway. Part of her wanted to drop the device and run and hide and hope that no one would ever know she had been here. But if she did that, the evidence would be destroyed. No one would believe her story. And whoever had planted this bomb would get away with it and try again. So Una stopped running. She sat in the shaft, holding the dead device in her lap, and waited for the drones to find her. They came around the corner. 30 seconds later, 2 floating machines with bright lights and scanning beams. They locked onto her immediately, and a cold mechanical voice ordered her to remain still. Metal arms reached out and grabbed her, not gently, and began dragging her backward through the shaft. Una did not fight. She did not scream. She held onto the device and let them take her, because she knew that whatever happened next, she had done the right thing. The drones pulled her out of the shaft and into a bright corridor. Guards were waiting there, real guards, not machines. They were tall Kef soldiers in silver armor, and they looked at her with disgust and confusion. A human child, covered in dirt, holding what looked like a bomb. They did not ask questions. They did not let her explain. They simply grabbed her arms and began marching her toward the upper decks, toward the Emperor. Yuna had never seen the Emperor before. She had never even been to the upper decks, where the important people lived. She had spent her whole life in the dark places of the ship, invisible and forgotten. Now she was being dragged into the light, and she had no idea if she would survive what came next. But she held her head up anyway. She had done something good. She had done something brave. Whatever happened now, no one could take that away from her. The observation hall was the most beautiful place Yuna had ever seen. The ceiling was made entirely of glass, showing the endless stars of space above. The walls were covered in gold and silver decorations that seemed to glow with their own light. The floor was so clean and polished that Yuna could see her own reflection in it, a small, dirty girl surrounded by giants. The room was full of Keth. They stood in groups, talking quietly, wearing clothes that probably cost more than Yuna's life was worth. They all turned to look when the guards dragged her in, and their faces showed surprise, then disgust, then curiosity. At the far end of the room, on a raised platform, sat Emperor Taiho. Yuna had heard stories about him. Every slave had. He was 200 years old, which was young for a Keth ruler. He had fought in wars, crushed rebellions, and built the empire into the most powerful force in the galaxy. Some said he was cruel. Others said he was fair. Everyone agreed that he was dangerous. He did not look dangerous right now. He looked bored. He sat on his throne with his chin resting on one of his 4 hands, watching the guards approach with tired eyes. Next to him stood 3 other Keth, who were different colors, the faction leaders, Yuna guessed. They had come for a peace meeting, and now they were staring at her like she was an interesting insect. The guards threw Yuna onto the floor in front of the throne. She hit the ground hard, but she managed to hold on to the device. She would not let go of it, no matter what. "Your Majesty," the security chief said, bowing deeply. "We found this human in a restricted ventilation shaft on Deck 17. She was holding this device, which appears to be an explosive mechanism." The room went silent. The faction leaders looked at each other. The Emperor straightened in his throne, his eyes suddenly sharp and focused. "An explosive?" One of the faction leaders said. "In this ship? During this meeting? It seems like a clumsy assassination attempt," another faction leader said. "Using a human slave? How desperate. Perhaps it was planted by someone who wanted to blame humans," the third faction leader said, looking at the Emperor with suspicious eyes. The security chief stepped forward. "We should interrogate the human and find out who sent her. With your permission, Your Majesty, I will take her to the detention level and... no." The Emperor's voice was not loud, but it silenced everyone immediately. He stood up from his throne and walked down the steps toward Yuna. He moved slowly, gracefully, like a predator who had no need to hurry. Yuna stayed on the ground, her eyes fixed on the floor. She knew she was supposed to look down. Slaves never looked at their masters directly. It was disrespectful. It was dangerous, but as the Emperor's feet came into view, just inches from her face, something inside her refused to stay quiet. She had not come this far, risked this much, just to die without anyone knowing the truth. She lifted her head and looked the Emperor in the eye. He was tall, even taller than the other Keth. His silver skin was darker than most, almost gray, and his eyes were a deep purple color that seemed to glow faintly. He had scars on his face, old ones, from battles fought long ago. He looked like someone who had seen everything and was surprised by nothing. But when Yuna met his gaze, something flickered in those ancient eyes. Surprise, maybe, or curiosity. She was not sure. "You looked at me," he said. His voice was calm, almost amused. "Do you not know that slaves are forbidden to look at the Emperor?" "I know, Your Majesty," Yuna said. Her voice was small, but it did not shake. "But I need to tell you the truth, and I cannot do that while staring at the floor." A murmur went through the room. Slaves did not speak this way. Slaves did not speak at all unless directly commanded. The Emperor tilted his head, studying her like she was a puzzle he wanted to solve. "Then tell me the truth, little human. Tell me why you were in a restricted shaft with a bomb in your hands." Yuna took a deep breath and began to speak. She told him everything. She told him about her job cleaning the ventilation system, about the strange smell she had noticed, about finding the device attached to the air conduit. She explained how she had studied it, how she had figured out which wire to cut, how she had disarmed it just seconds before the timer ran out. She used words that surprised everyone listening. She talked about energy flow and trigger mechanisms and failsafe systems. She described the device with a precision that made the security chief frown and the faction leaders exchange worried looks. When she finished, the room was completely silent. The Emperor stared at her for a long moment. Then he turned to his chief engineer, a thin Keth with nervous hands who had been standing near the wall. "You heard her explanation," the Emperor said. "Is it possible?" The engineer stepped forward, looking uncomfortable. "Your Majesty, she is a human child. She has no training, no education. How could she possibly?" "I asked if it was possible," the Emperor interrupted. "Not if it was likely. Take the device. Examine it. Tell me if her story matches the evidence." The engineer bowed and took the device from Yuna's hands. He left the room quickly, his footsteps echoing in the silence. The Emperor looked at Yuna again. "If you are lying, you will die slowly and painfully. You understand this?" "Yes, Your Majesty. And yet you do not seem afraid." Yuna thought about that. She was afraid. She was terrified. But she had been afraid her whole life, and it had never stopped her from doing what needed to be done. "I am afraid," she said honestly. "But I am not lying. And being afraid of dying is not as bad as knowing I could have saved people and did not." The Emperor's expression did not change, but something shifted in his eyes. He turned away from her and walked back to his throne, sitting down heavily. "We will wait," he said, "and we will see." The minutes felt like hours. Yuna stayed on the floor, her knees aching, her body exhausted. The faction leaders whispered among themselves. The guards stood at attention, ready to execute her the moment the Emperor gave the word. Then the chief engineer returned. His face was pale, and his hands were shaking. "Your Majesty," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "She is telling the truth." The device was designed to release a neural toxin into the air supply for this room. If it had detonated, everyone here would be dead. The human child disarmed it correctly. She saved all of our lives. The room erupted into chaos. The faction leaders shouted at each other, demanding investigations, accusing each other of treachery. The guards looked confused, unsure of what to do with the small girl still kneeling on the floor through all of it. The Emperor sat in silence, his eyes fixed on Yuna. She looked back at him, too tired to be afraid anymore, and waited to learn if she would live or die. The shouting continued for several minutes. The faction leaders blamed each other. The security chief demanded an immediate investigation. Advisors whispered urgently into the Emperor's ears. Everyone seemed to have forgotten about the small, human girl still kneeling on the polished floor. Everyone except Emperor Taiho. He raised one hand, and the room fell silent. The Keth had learned over centuries that when the Emperor moved, you paid attention. When he spoke, you listened. And when he was silent, you waited. Taiho stood from his throne and descended the steps once again. This time, he did not stop a few feet away from Yuna. He walked until he was standing directly in front of her, so close that she could have reached out and touched him. "Look at me," he commanded. Yuna lifted her head. Her neck ached from looking down for so long, and her body was trembling with exhaustion. But she forced herself to meet his gaze. The emperor studied her face for a long moment. He looked at her rough hands, her thin arms, her ragged clothes. He looked at the bruises on her knees and the calluses on her palms. He looked at her eyes, dark and tired, but still burning with something that refused to die. "How old are you?" he asked. 11 years, Your Majesty." "And how long have you been a slave?" "Since I was 6, Your Majesty." "Maybe before." "I do not remember clearly. Where is your family?" Yuna hesitated. This was not the kind of question masters usually asked. "My mother is dead or gone, Your Majesty." "I do not know which." "I never knew my father." "I have no one?" The emperor nodded slowly. Then he did something that made everyone in the room gasp. He knelt down. The Emperor of the Keth, ruler of 1,000 worlds, commander of the largest fleet in the galaxy, knelt on the floor in front of a human slave child. The faction leaders stopped whispering. The guards forgot how to breathe. Even Yuna stared at him with wide eyes, unable to understand what was happening. "This child," Taiho said, his voice echoing through the silent hall, "had every reason to let that bomb explode. She is a slave in an empire that treats her kind as property. She has been beaten and traded and ignored her entire life. No one has ever shown her kindness. No one has ever given her hope. And yet, when she found a weapon that would have killed her masters, she chose to save us instead." He looked around the room, his purple eyes burning with an intensity that made even the faction leaders look away. "What does that say about her? What does that say about us?" No one answered. No one dared. The emperor reached up to his own neck and removed a medallion that hung there on a golden chain. Yuna had seen this medallion before in pictures and statues. It was the seal of imperial favor, the highest honor in the Keth Empire. Only 12 beings in history had ever worn it. Taiho placed the medallion around Yuna's neck. "From this moment forward," he declared, "this girl is no longer a slave. She is a ward of the Imperial House under my personal protection. Anyone who harms her, insults her, or treats her as less than what she is will answer to me directly." Yuna's hands were shaking as she touched the medallion. It was warm and heavy, and she could feel strange symbols carved into its surface. She wanted to say something, but no words came out. The emperor stood and turned to face the room. "Furthermore, I am ordering a review of human classification across the empire. Any species capable of producing a child like this one is not inferior. They are not animals. They are not property. The laws of this empire will recognize this truth, or the laws will change." One of the faction leaders stepped forward. His name was Doko, and he was known for his cruelty toward lesser species. "Your Majesty, with respect, you cannot change 10,000 years of tradition because of one unusual child. Humans, the emperor interrupted, just saved your life. This child, who you would not even look at an hour ago, is the reason you are still breathing. Perhaps you should consider that before you tell me what I can and cannot do." Doko opened his mouth to argue, then closed it again. He was ambitious, but he was not stupid. Challenging the emperor in public, after what had just happened, would be political suicide. Ho looked at the other faction leaders. "This meeting was called to discuss peace between our factions. Someone tried to murder us all and blame it on chaos or incompetence. I suggest we focus on finding that enemy instead of arguing about the worth of the girl who saved us." The faction leaders nodded slowly, their faces thoughtful. They were politicians, and they knew how to read the room. The mood had shifted. The emperor had made his position clear. Fighting him on this issue would gain them nothing. Yuna finally found her voice. "Your Majesty," she said softly. "Why?" The emperor looked down at her. For a moment, his stern face softened into something almost gentle. "Why what, child?" Why are you doing this? I am nobody. I have nothing. Why does saving your life matter more than 1,000 other slaves who have done nothing wrong? It was a dangerous question. Slaves did not question their masters, especially not emperors. But Yuna had stopped caring about rules the moment she cut that blue wire. She had almost died to do the right thing, and she deserved to understand why the right thing was being done for her. Taiho was silent for a long moment. Then he spoke, and his voice was quieter than before, almost private despite the hundreds of people listening. When I was young, he said, my teacher told me that the measure of a civilization is not how it treats its strongest members, but how it treats its weakest. I forgot that lesson for a long time. Power made me forget. But you reminded me tonight. He looked at the medallion on her chest. You did what was right when no one was watching. You showed courage when you had every reason to be afraid. You chose to save others when you could have let them die. That is not the behavior of property. That is the behavior of a hero. Yuna felt tears running down her face. She did not try to stop them. She had not cried in years, had trained herself not to cry because crying drew attention and attention was dangerous. But now, in this moment, she could not hold it back anymore. I do not want to be a hero, she whispered. I just wanted to do what was right. The Emperor smiled a small smile, barely visible but real. That is exactly why you are one. He turned to the chief engineer, who was still standing at the edge of the room, holding the disarm bomb. Take Yuna to the medical bay. Make sure she is healthy. Then assign her quarters in the royal wing. She will begin her education tomorrow. The engineer bowed deeply. Yes, Your Majesty. As Yuna was led out of the observation hall, she looked back over her shoulder. The faction leaders were talking again, but now their conversations were different. They were looking at her, really looking for the first time, seeing not a slave but a person who had done something remarkable. The Emperor had returned to his throne, but his eyes followed her until she disappeared through the doors. Yuna did not know what the future would hold. She did not know if the Emperor's words would actually change anything, or if tomorrow she would wake up and find that it had all been a dream. But as she walked through the gleaming corridors of the upper decks, wearing a medallion that marked her as someone important, she allowed herself to feel something she had not felt in 5 years. Hope. 10 years had passed since the night Yuna disarmed a bomb in a ventilation shaft and changed the course of galactic history. She stood now on the bridge of a ship called the New Dawn, watching a fleet of vessels move through the darkness of space. Some of the ships were Keth designed, sleek and silver. Others were newer, built with technology that had not existed a decade ago. And the crews that flew them were mixed Keth and humans working side by side, equals in every way that mattered. Yuna was 21 years old now. She had grown tall for a human, though still short compared to the Keth. Her dark hair was longer than it had been, and she wore it tied back in a practical knot. Her hands were no longer rough with calluses from cleaning shafts. Instead, they were stained with ink and oil from the engineering projects she worked on constantly. She was the youngest grand engineer in the history of the Keth Empire. She had designed the propulsion system that powered the new fleet, a system that cut travel time between star systems in half. She had solved problems that had puzzled Keth scientists for centuries, and she had done it not despite being human, but because of it. Humans, it turned out, thought differently than Keth. They saw patterns that Keth missed. They asked questions that Keth never considered. They brought a creativity and stubbornness to problems that opened new paths forward. This was the revolution that Yuna had sparked without even trying. Not a violent uprising, not a war of revenge, but something quieter and more powerful. Humans across the empire had started showing what they could do when given the chance. They solved problems. They created art. They built things. They proved, one person at a time, that they were not inferior. The Emancipation Decree had freed every human slave in the Empire, 3 years after Yuna's rescue. It was not easy. Many Keth resisted the change. Some faction leaders had tried to fight the new laws. But the Emperor had been firm, and the image of him kneeling before a human child had spread to every corner of the galaxy. It was hard to argue that humans were worthless when the most powerful being in the universe had honored one so publicly. The Integration Acts came 2 years later, granting humans full citizenship. Now, in the 10th year after that fateful night, humans held positions of power throughout the Empire. They were doctors and teachers and engineers and leaders. They were not just surviving anymore. They were thriving, and it had all started with one small girl who refused to stay invisible. The door to the bridge opened, and Emperor Taiho walked in. He was older now, his silver skin showing signs of age, his movements slower than they had been. But his eyes were still sharp, still seeing more than anyone else in the room. Yuna turned and bowed her head slightly, a gesture of respect between equals, not the groveling of a slave. "Your Majesty, I was not expecting you." Taiho smiled and walked to stand beside her at the viewport. "I wanted to see the fleet before it launched, and I wanted to talk to you." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the stars. They had talked many times over the years, and Yuna had come to understand the Emperor better than most. He was not a simple man. He had done terrible things in his long life, conquered worlds and destroyed enemies without mercy. But he had also changed more in the past decade than any ruler before him. "Do you ever regret it?" Yuna asked quietly. "Regret what?" "Changing everything. The old ways had worked for 10,000 years. Some people think you weakened the Empire by freeing the humans." Taiho laughed softly. "Some people are fools. The Empire is stronger now than it has ever been. Our technology is advancing faster. Our economy is growing. Our people, all our people, are more loyal because they have something worth being loyal to." He looked at her. "Besides, the old ways were built on a lie. We told ourselves that we were superior because it made us feel powerful. But power that depends on keeping others weak is not real power. It is just fear dressed up in fancy clothes." Yuna nodded. This was something she had thought about often. The Keth had ruled through strength for so long that they had forgotten there was another way. They had become so used to looking down on others that they never thought to look across. "You know," Taiho said, "when I gave you that medallion 10 years ago, I thought I was paying a debt. You saved my life, so I saved yours. A simple transaction. But it became something more," Yuna finished. "Yes, I did not expect you to change everything. I thought you would be grateful, live quietly, fade into the background of history." He shook his head, smiling. "I should have known better. You were never the kind of person who fades." Yuna thought about the little girl she had been, crawling through dark shafts, trying to be invisible. She remembered how afraid she had been, how alone, how sure that she would never matter to anyone. "I did not try to change everything," she said. "I just kept doing what felt right. One problem at a time, one day at a time." "That is exactly how everything changes," Taiho replied. "Not through grand plans or great speeches. Through small choices made by ordinary people who refuse to accept that things cannot be better." The fleet was beginning to move now, ships gliding away from the station toward open space. This fleet would establish the first joint Keth-human colony in a distant sector. It was a symbol of the new empire, a proof that two species could build something together that neither could build alone. "My mother used to tell me something," Yuna said softly. "She said we do what is right, even when it is hard. Especially when it is hard." I think about those words every day. Taiho was quiet for a moment. "Your mother must have been a remarkable woman," She was. The empire your people built took her from me. I should hate you for that. Sometimes I wonder why I do not. Why do you think? Yuna considered the question. It was something she had struggled with for years, how to hold both truths in her heart at once. The empire had destroyed her family, stolen her childhood, treated her as property. And the empire had also given her a chance, educated her, raised her up, allowed her to become something she never could have imagined. Because hate does not build anything, she said finally. It only destroys. And I want to build. I want to create something that will last long after I am gone. Something that will make sure no other little girl has to grow up the way I did. The emperor nodded slowly. That is the difference between revenge and justice. Revenge looks backward. Justice looks forward. The last ships of the fleet disappeared into the darkness, jumping to faster-than-light speed toward their new home. Yuna watched them go, feeling a strange mixture of pride and sadness. She was sending thousands of people, humans and Keth, together to start a new chapter of history. And she would not be there to see it unfold. I am dying, you know, Taiho said quietly. Yuna turned to look at him, startled. What? Old age, nothing more. Keth live a long time, but not forever. I have perhaps a year left, maybe 2. He did not seem afraid, just thoughtful. I have been thinking about what I will leave behind. You will leave behind a changed galaxy, Yuna said. An empire that is better than the one you inherited. Perhaps. But empires are fragile things. They can change direction quickly when power shifts. I worry about what will happen when I am gone. Yuna understood what he was not saying. Not all Keth supported the changes he had made. There were still those who wanted to return to the old ways, who resented the rise of humans, who saw the integration as a weakness to be corrected. Then we will have to make sure the change is too deep to undo, she said. We will have to make sure that everyone, Keth and human alike, understands that this is not just your policy. It is who we are now. Taiho smiled, and for a moment he looked like the younger man he had once been, fierce and determined and full of fire. You see why I wanted to talk to you. You have always understood what matters. He turned away from the viewport and began walking toward the door. Then he stopped and looked back at her. I have made many mistakes in my life, he said. But kneeling before you in that hall was not one of them. It was the best decision I ever made. He left, and Yuna stood alone on the bridge, watching the stars. She thought about the journey she had taken, from a nameless slave in a ventilation shaft to one of the most important people in the galaxy. She thought about all the humans who had been inspired by her story, who had found the courage to show their own worth. She thought about the future, uncertain, challenging, but full of possibility. And she thought about her mother, whose words had guided her through the darkest moments of her life. We do what is right, Yuna whispered to the stars. Even when it is hard. Especially when it is hard. The galaxy stretched out before her, endless and beautiful. Somewhere out there, the seeds of a new civilization were being planted, a civilization where species worked together instead of conquering each other, where worth was measured by character rather than birth, where a small girl from nowhere could change everything. It had started with a spark. One choice, made in a moment of fear, by someone who had nothing to gain and everything to lose. And now that spark had become a fire that would light the darkness for generations to come. Humanity had proven something that night 10 years ago. They had proven that courage did not require power, that compassion was not weakness, that the smallest person in the universe could make the biggest difference.